Welcome back to Cloud Computing and Big Data. We have the second part of our lecture 7 on deep learning applications in clouds. And we had in the first part made another move, basically from the handwritten character recognition 10 class problem that we have seen in lecture 6, basically for initiating a little bit what the idea is to go from machine learning to deep learning. We really moved in lecture 7 in the first part then to larger applications. And one of that was in the field of Earth observation, remote sensing of essentially the Earth using satellites. And these satellites have a very interesting set of images. They are not only RGB images, they're actually also hyperspectral images reaching with different spectral channels into the Earth, if you want. So it's a quite interesting application domain, and the data sets that coming out of the satellites are enormous. So we're talking here about gigabytes, and newer, let's say, satellites really around terabytes. And we can see that the resolution of these satellites is really increasing significantly. Just a short question for the participants, please to mute. Otherwise, I go ahead. And this is basically then the connection of making the point for big data. So on one hand, right, so why we need cloud computing, hence because your little laptop or your little desktop computer cannot take all the satellite images anymore. MNIST was a different story. It's a teaching or training data set, a toy problem if you want, still capturing nicely, of course, the essence of machine learning to learn handwritten character recognition, but it was 26 by 26 pixels. So if that's all what cloud computing can do, thank you very much. But here in the Earth observation case that we had in the first part, we saw already then the definitively need, firstly, to go to the cloud for storage, but then we also moved to something called residual networks. So we had, let's say, the cutting edge or more powerful convolutional networks than we had, for instance, in lecture 6 investigated, and quickly saw a demand for distributed training, distributed deep learning, as it is called, where then the idea is to not only use one GPU really for this training of these networks, which would be already an acceleration compared to using a CPU, but here we want to use different GPUs at once. And that's what we had a little bit discussed in the first part and also shown some limits. So coming then now to more advanced concepts of deep learning, this is coming a little bit back to some of the concepts we had in lecture 6, also because we want to connect them a little bit with the material here of lecture 7. Of course, several aspects that I also had in the part 1 and that I will have here in part 2, I will actually demonstrate in the practical lecture 7.1 that is about to come. So some of the, let's say, the ideas how you really use it then in practice will of course come in the practical lecture or as part of your assignment 2 that we will also discuss later. So for the advanced concepts, we start a little bit again with a small kind of neat tool I wanted to show you again, because it captures nicely how deep learning is basically learning. Normally, I don't do in this conceptual lectures big demonstrations or so. That I would just to show you the tool a little bit here. That is also then in the references that you can use, but you show you can start here with some learning. You can build your, let's say, neurons that you want to have, different data sets to analyze, all of them, of course, not the really cutting edge ones from Earth observation, but you see different interesting elements in it when you learn from it. So when we learn now, and this is reflecting to the, let's say, layers we discussed before, the number of layers, the activation functions you can play with. So it's a bit more, let's say, broader in a sense that we had the character recognition set. But of course, here we are basically limited a little bit to the idea that is given to us here. So we don't paint ourselves in terms of features. We can add different features and then learn the model. And you see how here now the decision boundaries are putting up nicely this non-linearity that you see also in this data set. For instance, you see the training loss here is actually almost nothing, and the test set loss is a little bit more, which is I think perfectly normal. And you see it learned this particular data set increasingly well. This is related to the capability or the capacity really of the learning model, you would say, right? We have 4 neurons here in the hidden layer. We have massaged the data with nice features. Now, when we have the same, let's say a very simple more neuron that we have discussed before, and put that into, just 2 hidden layers, and we'll learn again, you will see that the capacity of the model somehow cannot grab this. If you remember, this would be also representing a bit like the XOR problem, right, that we have here on both sides. So it's a nice tool to play with. I just give you this here a little bit in, because then I think some can really understand machine learning better with it, where you then can add more and more capability, power of the deep learning, or basically of the learning network here, and play with it and see that over time it will come to different elements. For instance, here adding maybe one output might be already quite nice. And you see that how basically you really need a bigger capacity to really fill that gap, and also give you more input features to really learn from this, as we have seen before, more powerfully, and bringing down the error slope here. So just as a, let's say, appetizer for those that want to use it, I think it's a quite nice tool, being publicly for free available. That's why I want to promote it here in my lectures. But let's coming back to some of the advanced features, which are then a little bit also related to what we have seen, right? So one for it is, of course, now to understand a little bit the architectures a bit better. Zooming in, as I would call it, which is quite interesting now also to understand now the idea of distributed deep learning, right? So distributed deep learning, what you do then, and when you have here, for instance, an input of 204 pixels each, and have an RGB channel in, and then you have the different convolutional areas we discussed, right? The layers, and there's always a pooling layer. What is omitted here is a little bit the activation functions that are of course in, and basically you see a little bit the architecture known as an AlexNet. Around 1,000 neurons are in the output layer, so you can quite nicely do something with it. So it's quite a powerful tool for computer vision, and was one of the first ones where deep learning showed really impact. It uses different kernel sizes that we have used for the feature maps, if you remember. So 5 by 5, for instance, you see here 3 by 3, and maybe for the original image an 11 by 11, to further and further craft features out of it. And again, the same message goes. The last layer was this kind of dense layer that then is fully connected with each other. And the interesting thing is to show that now is that this is not the case for the others, and we will make a case for it with weight sharing and so on. So in a way, of course, the neurons are still connected with each other, but they do certain tricks. And one of the tricks is, for instance, the weight sharing I will come to in a moment. So hence, if you zoom into these architectures, there's even more differences, not only from the kernel sizes and the poolings. It could be an average pooling, could be a max pooling. It has also something to do with strides, how you go over the data set, and also these techniques I wanted to show you a little bit in the next couple of minutes. And some of the idea also why it's so effective, which is important, I think, that the idea is that you have a certain translation and rotation invariant. So you can basically see features which are, let's say, a human head, which is not anymore just, basically in the center of the image, looks up straight, with the eyes really in parallel, perhaps to the surrounding pictures, whatever. Or as it is here with the pictures of dogs in the middle of the image, what you train. The interesting element is because you learn these feature maps, it detects the features also when it's essentially, let's say, for instance, on the top right corner, or the dog, as I also showed you before, with the face, right? If the face of a human is just half, it's still detected in parts. And the same as a dog, maybe that is just half of the image, it is detected in parts. So these are interesting features which then actually give the possibility for these deep learning networks to be so good. And the feature maps is really one of the key elements, also differentiating it now again from the neural networks that we have seen before, right? Where we said the artificial neural network with the 2 hidden layers. This was nothing like this at all. These were just, let's say, signals coming through one-dimensionally, right, in the beginning, getting through the network with backpropagation of error. You will update the weights time after time, put the signal through, and you can still learn from it, but you don't have a 2D structure. And the interesting thing is, even now you can say that the convolution networks, you can even do a 3D approach to the problem. Let's say you have different channels, right? Like RGB, for instance, you know, from an image. But if you talked about, for instance, you remember when we talked about the remote sensing, right? The Earth observation data sets, they have different spectral channels in the Earth as dimensions, right? And they have not 1, 2, 3 like RGB. They have 100 of them. Some of them are overlapping with different spectrums of light. So that means we can have some, let's say, compression there. We don't need to look at maybe perhaps every single, let's say, spectral channel there. But this is something where there's a very rich information coming in, and we can digest it as is in this networks. However, and that is now the interesting part coming back perhaps here, you would think, why have people you know, put a 200, 204, you know, 224 image here, pixel by pixel, instead of maybe 1,000 times 1,000 and so on? Because you have to pay the price for it again, right? So think about what that means when you come through all this network, having very large images. So we still see in practice, for instance, in COVID, when we have analyzed chest X-rays, that lots of these images are still boiled down, basically, although from the hospitals we would have high resolution data of this, basically from directly scanners and so on. For computational reasons, usually the kind of images are still downsampled. And when you downsample it, let's say put it into pixels 224, sorry, here, then you, of course, can think about it that you lose information, right? Of course, by shrinking the image into this particular small resolution, you also lose something. And this is something where when you come to a real application domain problem, you have to find the balance, right, in doing so. But coming back maybe to the idea of this weight sharing and translation invariance, that, you know, basically your features in the image can be even, let's say, not really in the center of the image. Here's another idea how that works when you have basically here this interesting fellow that we essentially as a feature detect at once. And we have this a little bit also with the numbers that we have in the MNIST, right? In this kind of interactive tools, we have said, okay, there are certain parts of a zero in some of the layers that were just different types of zeros. And this is a feature that is learned. And then by going through over it with the tensors through these different ones, instead of doing the idea of a fully connected unit, which would be basically something that a dense neural network is doing in the artificial neural network we had before with 2 hidden layers, we have a certain locality or receptive field assumption, essentially like the human is looking over a picture, right? So we have always this striding then that we go over it, and then have the convolutional field feature in order to train it, as we have seen in the overall architecture diagram. That's why we basically go over it. But in order, when we do the weight sharing here, this of course enables us to detect then in this larger image, where are the features basically that might be this kind of fellow, right? Let's assuming this fellow would be fitting in this kind of 3x3, or at least partly. This neuron will fire, right? But it will also fire this neuron because the weight is still shared. And even if this fellow is not only here or here, it will still fire because the weight of this kind of feature that is learned in these channels is then essentially, let's say, firing in the next layer. And this is an important concept now of enabling then this translation invariance. And with weight sharing, of course, you can imagine you have sort of less weights to train. So in one respect, you would say it's actually more effective than doing this fully connected unit, because then you would learn every little weight with every little neuron being connected to every little other neuron in the other layer. But of course, think about that this is partly true, yes, but we have, of course, a deeper structure of the neural network usually. And we have also different feature maps, right? If you remember, we had a couple of them in the MNIST use case, for instance. And there's, of course, a hyperparameter you can steer, or the architecture controls, basically, of the neural network. But there, of course, then comes again more computing in. So what you basically win a little bit with weight sharing, of course, in terms of computing, in contrast to the fully connected unit, you, in a sense, lose of having a deeper network, but then also more feature maps where more of this weight sharing is happening. However, the weight sharing in this respect is much more effective of really firing when, let's say, features are detected. And the interesting part now is, of course, thinking about when you go now through the data set, hidden layer by hidden layer, and you will do the convolution as it is, for instance, also explained here in this little video with this different filters over the data. You come to different feature maps and you do it again, and you do it again. Like the overall diagram we have seen, the deepness comes from this. From this, you break down the big features, like perhaps this fellow here, right, that we want to detect, to smaller features, right, which are more the edges, corners, maybe parts of the ear here, the round things that fire several times, right? So it's probably here seen, it's here seen, but even on the head seen, on the nose, it's quite round. So smaller features will fire more often, of course, in the image, helping then also to really, in the higher layers up, to recognize, this is a kind of feature that is fired in combination with each other. And with this would be, of course, in the weight update, because it's still doing, of course, back propagation, right? A bit modified because we have now deep learning networks, but it still back propagates the error back in this particular example here of a, let's say, more larger convolutional neural network. So hence, this is a more advanced view on it, and make the case that, of course, this means also lots of computing power. Also, depending of how you usually go through this, it can be quite computing intensive. If you have convolutional kernels, also think about that this can be even in 3D. And you see a little bit how the stride is working here. You can have a convolutional kernel going, let's say, 2 by 2 over the data with stride 1. And then you see you're basically starting in maybe here in the corner, and you just by 1 pixel, for instance, or by, you know, whatever it is, what you have here is a pixel, go 1 to the right, 1 more, and having always 2 by 2, and we'll move through the data. It's much more dense information and preserves, of course, lots of information than doing now a stride 2, where you basically have 0 overlap, right? So in a way, you're faster, less computing. You see a 3 by 3 kernel, you can use this. And these are all degrees of freedom that you have to choose, basically, in this, you know, deep learning frameworks and architectures. And with this come to the idea that, of course, also that influences your computing needs. But it also, of course, affects now the quality of the network. So if it is really detecting better features and so on, which in a way is then the dealing of how you identify certain patterns in the data again and again. Let's say if this feature is fired again and again and again, let's say you have many pictures with cars and you have the feature of a tire learned, you can imagine that this will be very strong, you know, connections, because you always learn the tire again and again by going through all the data. And of course, data is needed, so you need to go through this as I said earlier, with lots of batch sizes that all coming back then to the idea of epochs in the larger scale. So you break down the data into batch sizes, and then in different, you know, basically epochs, you go through these batch sizes, update, next batch size, update, until you come to the solution. Hence, big data is needed in a way for this deep learning to really do this feature learning. And if you now come back a little bit to what we learned in the beginning of the course, when we said, what are the features now, what the Irisitosa versus Virginica or had, you remember, was a bit like petal width and sepal width and so on. That was really lecture 2 and 3 and so on. Here now we think about completely different sets of features that take the locality into account. Right here, you see the same, how it works in remote sensing the same way. Instead of the flower, where you basically have then the idea of this, neighborhood preserved. We have also solutions where you then think, okay, a water pixel, there's a likely, there's likely another water pixel just close to it, and so on. And you see here the different spectral channels I was alluding to, right? So not only RGB images, but from the satellite, we get really hyperspectral or multispectral images. So the same idea now, of course, translate this to what we just had with the tire of the car. So with this locality, you're able to really have a bigger idea of what a building might be. Because you detect the building not anymore on a pixel by pixel by pixel sort of element, but you really detect it as a feature. That means a feature fires with all of these connections here that you learned as a whole, right? And I think this is a nice example when you think about, well, we as humans would say there's a sort of pattern here, right? And then I think that's pretty clear. And when you then say, okay, here you still see sort of a pattern here, it's still an X, it might be a bit distorted, and yeah, you're still sure as a human to do that. You can make the same connections then when you go, basically as a human through that you detected. When you do this on a, let's say, typical example of an artificial neural network we basically had before, it will be actually not really good. And the reasoning is, if you remember, we couldn't even digest this two-dimensional input. What we have done was basically creating a one long vector, right? We vectorized the input image. That was, of course, for the MNIST, but for the handwritten characters, right? And here it's the same procedure. So we would be doing a very long vector, and then in a way, this X is gone. So in contrast, what now the effective idea of these convolutional neural networks is, or of deep learning as a large, as feature learning, is preserving a little bit the locality, learning features. And you see that here is one feature where in the other image, actually by just seeing this here, it is actually firing at the same feature. Okay, so it is an X partly, but it also fires in this feature. Right? It is just, and this is now the important part, it has a location invariance. So it's actually not on the same location, because we see it's clearly distorted here. For whatever reason, it's not important why, but we see the same feature still firing. And in the heart of the picture, even if the X is distorted on the outer rim, you would say, the heart of the picture is still very X-like, right? If you ignore everything else. So the heart of the X has been detected. And I think it's sort of a little bit self-explanatory, but you can see now that for the next layer, that means, hey, here we have potentially an X, no matter if it's distorted or if it's a very strong X. And this makes these classifiers incredibly robust to, for instance, also as we have seen the MNIST data set, where sometimes the people have written the 6 like almost an 8 or almost a 0, but it will still detect the features that are inherent in the 6 quite a lot. And when you now come to the point why it's not 100%, you have some seen in, MNIST characters that where there was almost nothing to detect, right? So where our label said that should be a 1, but there would, and that was the reason why even the convolutional neural network had just 99 point something and not 100%, because there will be some X's like here that are so distorted that basically none of the features almost will fire, right? And this is the more technique underneath. And of course, in mathematics, you have this as then the convolution that you learn over time by putting this field over it. You can basically see that as a multiplication, and that's this is the reason why I put this with a filter in here, is to make you aware that, of course, this is a computing now, right? So this needs to be all computed in one direction from left to right. We just compute. I mean, we have the weights learned, we have the connection learns, the filters, everything is there. So we compute it, then we compare the outputs, and then with basically the backpropagation using so-called chain rule mathematics, which is something for the deep learning course you hopefully have learned. With backpropagating the error, you basically update the weights again and again based on these signals. Very similar like we have seen in the normal artificial neural network. and then you compute again from left to right. And then you have the guiding output, maybe the label and so on the right hand side. You see, okay, that is wrong class. And you have always this kind of updates of the weights based on your errors. And this is then also the point that with no more connections you have this amount of rising parameters that we have seen. By always doing this element-wise multiplication, these parameters needs to be computed, and that's why the GPU is quite also nice for it, because if you see how that can be then nicely parallelized, because it's basically independent, because you have often a matrix multiplication or a matrix vector multiplication. And if you remember a little bit what we had in earlier parts of the lectures, motivating the GPU, that many of the elements in a matrix vector multiplication can be nicely parallelized because they're not basically from each other dependent. And with this, a GPU is just beautiful to compute all of this. So here I make the connection back to very much the beginnings of the course, and saying that basically the computing is highly parallel possible, because we're talking here, you see that again, we see with the feature maps really, that again, we're talking about lots when you think this is lots of matrix or matrix vector multiplications, right, happening. And these can be beautifully parallelized in each of the different layers and on the whole element of the feature maps, because they're independent from each other. And with this, the speed up comes by using GPUs enormously. They are actually made for this quite a lot, as I was alluding to at the beginning of the course. And that's why essentially deep learning got to the, let's say, big success stories today, because we have the GPUs available. If we wouldn't have the GPU, the question is still if deep learning really would have been leading to Nobel Prizes that you have heard, hopefully, in the news just now. Actually, I can quote, right? So the Nobel Prize in Physics for Geoffrey Hinton, for instance, going to actually one of the phases of deep learning. You have seen it in I think chemistry, right? There was AlphaFold for protein folding, an AI technique. So basically, this is a good example for these techniques, and this is all given rise because, of course, these gentlemen I was just quoting, for instance, Geoffrey Hinton, are of course excellent thinkers and have good ideas already in the past of how to do it, but the computing was not following through. So now we have the GPUs. Now we can compute quite interesting things. And in the earlier lectures, I have showed you also generations of GPUs, with starting maybe from Kepler over to Volta, Ampere architectures, now to Grace Hopper cards from NVIDIA, for instance. And we see, of course, the AMD cards. There are more vendors now also providing us with the devices, with the GPU power to really make this kind of parallelization possible in a very high performance, point of perspective. Still, the GPUs, of course, are expensive. This comes also now to the point that larger systems in the past have been maybe, mostly constrained by the network interfaces, so interconnects between the different, let's say, racks. That was the most important feature of a HPC system, or why you want to go to cloud or bigger cloud systems here and there. But nowadays, you would say maybe the GPUs have surpassed this. So GPUs are quite expensive, but with more and more memory in HBM, for instance, from NVIDIA, you see also enormous capabilities. And as we started then lecture 7 today, if you really then interconnect these cards, there are essentially, again, no limits, but we also have seen with 500 GPUs or 1,000 GPUs, the problem of large batch sizes will catch you. And then you have the problem that essentially the nice area of always having better and better accuracy and so on will also not hold for every application. It enables us also to look to much more other applications, like we also know for large language models today, right? I come to this maybe towards the end of the lecture today. Just to contrast again a little bit the CNN architecture versus the artificial neural networks. Again, the comparison, how we used that in the past, to really get that in your head. That is a different type of, let's say, neural networks we're talking about usually when we talk about deep learning. I was saying in earlier lectures, don't add just hidden layer by hidden layer by hidden layer more to it. Doesn't make a deep learning network. It is a deep learning network in a sense that you add more hidden layers, maybe 50, but that will not give you then the power that we just talked about, the technique which plays a role here with the convolution layer pooling, basically strengthening the signals in one respect and then creating feature maps, recognizing features independent of their location in the picture and so on. And another way to look at this is this feature learning, which is really important in deep learning. You would say many of the features with the feature maps are really learned and extracted automatically by doing the deep learning algorithm. And of course, you still do some pre-processing of the data, right? You still have to, let's say, as I said, resize the image maybe. You have a dock here and you want to put it in this 224 by 224 a network we have seen before, and the picture is maybe 1024 by 1024. You have to resize the image, whatever pre-processing is required. But still, you take the image as a whole and give it to the algorithms, the learning algorithms and the architectures in order to learn the features, perhaps of a dog here. But then coming back to machine learning, that's what basically was always a human interaction almost, right? People have used MNIST by inverting the numbers, rotating the numbers, have done interesting things with the data set. The same in, remote sensing data sets. One of my PhDs or early PhDs who had nothing else to do than just preserving the neighborhood somehow for neural networks. So having tree-based algorithms for this in order to preserve the neighborhood. So, and then we were giving it to classification algorithms. So a big change, if you want, also in the terms of dimensionalities, which is so basically a little bit come to this, right? Think about that there's one-dimensional processing is now basically via the supercomputing we have available, also able to do in 3D, where you can recognize, of course, and interesting features across different dimensions. It is still lots of computing power needed for this, but that is also, of course, happening in clouds and in high-performance computers today. So this is not really hindering us if you want to do more research. And I think there are lots of examples around where you can see today, and I think the Physics Nobel Prize in a way stands for itself as a shining light, that this has been now used in almost every domain and sector probably where you can think of. The cars domain here for recognizing, of course, in images is just the start. Think about autonomous driving. I have an interesting video at the end here for you that, of course, this has now everywhere got an interesting impact. And the idea is, of course, still here and there using similar things. You see, learning the features of cars from the very, let's say, big picture down to low-level features. And of course, you can think it's at the end a fully connected layer with probabilities. Of course, some features in a car are also in a truck, tires maybe, right? An airplane could be partly also, seeing the front part here as an air wing. So some features will fire for an airplane, right? So we never would have maybe the 100% sure this is just this particular car. And so on and so on. But it has shown and stand the test of time that these algorithms really work. And in a way that I already talked about this, think just that, of course, here the often omitted elements is that, of course, it's not just one connection here. There's this weight sharing going on. You go over the whole pictures with this. We don't have this, one network, one neuron to the other neuron connection anymore in all these illustrations, but still rectified linear units are used. The kind of activation functions that we had in the beginning, they're still there and used to catch non-linearities in the data, right? Which is also another important part, like we have seen in the rectified linear unit, for instance. Then at the second part, we still flatten at some point in time, so vectorize a lot of the informations, but once the features we have there, they fire then at this particular point and to the fully connected network and the softmax probability fire and get us to these, let's say, features that really learn a car, truck, and van then. So this is still needed to learn a network like we have done before, but instead of crafting these features, we basically let now the machine do this for us. like the wheels I was saying, which would be fire for a car, for a truck, but for a car also many other features will fire. That's why in the end the fully dense network will come to the conclusion that from the probability, from all the fired features really and elements, it is most likely a car. And you can go and go on and go on. I think, of course, we always need better models. If I just take the case here of remote sensing again, and if you think here, the different satellites that are now in place, Copernicus, for instance, here, a huge satellite armada, there are more and more satellites being launched, enabling us more and more, let's say, resolution of the Earth to understand this. You see here a little bit the idea also when you want to perhaps understand the land cover, you don't just use the information that is basically directly from the top or from the surface of the Earth. You go into the Earth with the spectral channels, and this enables us also quite some interesting insights, making it a big data problem, really. We have talked about the ResNet 50, the need for distributed deep learning, and this requires also techniques which are really under the hood, not so simple to understand, but are required to interconnect different GPUs on the one hand, but also having certain technologies like Horobot here, for instance, that you would combine with TensorFlow to average the learning and basically exchange the learning. So what we see here is a model parallelism idea of doing distributed deep learning. And then every time you compute the gradients, if you remember, that was a little bit the learning step, right? And then you want to have this learning step, of course, also distributed between the others so that all of them benefit what you do locally. And that's come you basically to the point of having this batch sizes that you then distribute across the different GPUs that all have the different models here, computing it, the kind of learning step, exchanging it, so average the gradients. A technique called MPI or reduce is used for this, which is really then a really low-level technique that we actually teach much more in high-performance computing, but which is required to really exchange the learning progress between the different GPUs. And the Horobot framework is implementing it like this. And then with the average gradings, of course, you start to compute and train the model again, learn from it, etc., epoch by epoch. And by using then more and more of these, you break down, of course, with this, the idea of training, but have also then these effect I was alluding there before. So basically the problem of large batch sizes. I just point you at the end of this lecture also to this. Remember, we had this 1.2 millions in AlexNet to learn. Now, when we take about a cutting edge that we have basically used here in 2019 at that time, we had 25.6 millions of trainable parameters. Hence, lots of computing was required to do this with 96 GPUs. And if you go now to large language models, you see incredible number of parameters in the billions, right? So that's hence needs much more computing. And here's an interesting slide that even you can use MPI, as we have seen with the all reduce as an example, how to do this. It's just a communication protocol. You could think of doing it maybe also with MapReduce or with others like Spark we have seen. But there would be, let's say, terribly slow to do the average gradients, right? So you can still do it. The idea is of distributing the average of the gradients. But you see that from this study here, which is not so important for you, it's much more important for the high performance computing course, but it gives you an overview that actually MPI, the message passing interface, is still more used in practice today, sometimes more sockets, but that's really the modus operandi today. Then just as a sneak preview, what will come and what was also a little bit in the cloud from Google video I had for you in the first part. Right, so neuroarchitecture search. So what is that? We will talk about this again in one of the later lectures, as I was saying, but you can imagine that maybe for several images for like a beach, it's easier to recognize. So you would have different neuroarchitectures, simpler architectures for detecting a beach, than maybe this complicated panda bear here, right, which has a very interesting black pattern around the eyes, which not many have, especially if you have a white sort of face, right? So you can imagine that by not only thinking about the data, but also about the architecture, there's an optimization possible. That's called a search space, where you want to have a strategy to find the best architecture in the search space for a given set of data items. And you can do it in a fashion that, of course, there also automatism is basically put to lots of computing power to find over different trials and, let's say, different search strategies than the best, let's say, architectures for a given problem. And this has different objectives to fulfill. And again, we will talk about this much more in one of the later lectures. Just, that you understand that we're not stopping just by pictures. We're also thinking about maybe reducing the architecture can also save computing power for here and there use case and applications. There are more complex deep learning models also here towards the end of the lecture we're working with. What we didn't touch was time series data. I just want to give you this as an example here. We will talk long about this in this particular course here, but if you want, there's also YouTube lectures from me in the RACE project around this. I was showing you this earlier in one of the lectures before. So here we talk about really analyzing time series, not images, but even their deep learning with gated recurrent units, with long short-term memory cells that you see here, mimicking the idea of a memory here through all these different cells, digesting time step by time step by time step, with sort of gates influencing this learning process of the memory, if you want. You can show that deep learning has a big impact too. And of course, these are also requiring lots of computing power, but have been also shown now in natural language processing, which is nothing else than a time series in a sense of characters. But also, of course, in measurements. You see here Landsvirkjun, the power company of Iceland, where we work with also enormous interesting results. So there are many, of course, more advanced architectures than I was presenting. Autoencoders is a little bit one of the de facto standards today. You learn also interesting latent spaces, a sort of understanding of the data where you can look in, which enable you to better interpret perhaps the data even. And here's an encoder-decoder structure, which is basically the overall architecture of these. Hence, what I showed you was a simple convolution of a problem is not just deep learning. Deep learning is very powerful, huge, with transformers, autoencoders. So if you have interest, and of course, some of you may even take the deep learning course, which hopefully teaches you all of the concepts much more than I can in a cloud course. But there's interesting elements happening, especially as some of them are also going towards unsupervised learning, right? Which, for instance, here reconstructing the input image, if you want, as the output of a 7 here, without having any given label. And this is something where this is incredibly powerful also in many applications. Finally, of course, I just wanted to show you one publication we did, for instance, in the cloud with a gentleman here, Hout. Also in the cloud, of course, you can do with Spark similar things, right? So you can here see how we use this with an autoencoder, just what I showed you in the area of remote sensing, again, using essentially these open source tool sets in order to have, let's say, again, the idea of a compressed image representation from the Earth's surface, taking into account, again, the spectral channels that we have here in the hyperspectral, images that we got from the satellite. And of course, the details of that would require a complete 40 minutes, so I cannot talk about this. But you see similar concepts has been used that we have been before with worker nodes and enabling us for scalability, performing then the different steps in the autoencoder model. And if you're interested, of course, the publication has much more details, but some of the things you will know because it follows also the idea of Spark we have discussed before with the different tasks in the nodes, the data that is partitions across the nodes, and then one of the, let's say, master worker paradigm, someone in the Spark context that follows through the whole application. And I could go on and go on to now, see that deep learning has filled our minds quite significantly, hence the Nobel Prize, I think. So we use it in many different applications. One of them I just wanted to show you very briefly here that many of you will know.